Keanu Reeves sat in the green room of the television studio, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. The space was sterile and cold, with white walls and bright fluorescent lights that made everything feel artificial. He'd done this hundreds of times before, interviews, appearances, talking about movies and projects. But today felt different. He could sense it in the way the production assistants moved around him, how they wouldn't quite meet his eyes. They kept checking their phones, exchanging glances with each other when they thought he wasn't looking. A tall woman with a clipboard approached him. Her name was Victoria, and she'd been in touch with his team for the past 2 weeks about this appearance. She smiled, but it wasn't her usual warm smile. It was tighter, rehearsed, like she was following a script. "Hey Keanu, we're almost ready," she said, sitting down across from him. "Just want to do a quick final run-through of the topics we'll be covering today." Keanu nodded. He'd been in this industry long enough to know the routine. Victoria opened her tablet and scrolled through notes. He expected the usual questions about his new film, his thoughts on acting, maybe something about his upcoming projects. That's what his team had been promised when they agreed to this interview for the afternoon talk show. But as Victoria started to list the topics, something felt off. The order of the questions had changed. The production team wanted to start with personal questions before moving into his professional work. When Keanu asked her to clarify what kind of personal questions, Victoria's jaw tightened just slightly. "Oh, you know, the usual stuff. Where you're from, your family background, how you spend your free time," she said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. Keanu wasn't born yesterday. He'd dealt with invasive media for decades. He could read between the lines now. Something about this interview wasn't right. He'd learned over the years that when production teams got nervous like this, when they avoided direct eye contact, it usually meant they had something up their sleeve. Something they knew he wouldn't want to talk about. He decided not to push it yet. No point in causing trouble before he even walked on stage. Sometimes these things work themselves out. Sometimes producers just got nervous about booking big names. So he told Victoria it all sounded fine, even though he didn't believe it for a second. After she left, Keanu was alone in the green room again. He picked up his phone and scrolled through some emails. His manager had sent him a few messages wishing him luck, reminding him to keep things light and friendly. "Just be yourself," she'd written. "The audience loves you." The thing was, Keanu had learned a long time ago that being yourself in the public eye was complicated. There was the version of himself he showed on screen, the thoughtful and often serious actor people knew from his films. Then there was the version he showed in interviews, friendly, articulate, careful not to reveal too much. And then there was his real self, the one he kept hidden away, the one that had experienced real pain, real loss, real struggle. That version rarely made it into the public consciousness, and honestly, that's the way Keanu liked it. But over the years, he'd noticed something changing. The media had become hungrier. They wanted more access, more details, more pieces of his private life to turn into content. They didn't just want to talk about his work anymore. They wanted to talk about his heartbreak, his tragedies, his family. And they wanted to do it in ways that felt like entertainment, like his deepest pains were just another thing to discuss over coffee while people watched. Keanu had lost count of how many times journalists had brought up his sister during interviews. How many times producers had asked him to talk about his relationships, his loss, as if these were just regular topics of conversation. He'd always handled it with grace. He'd given measured responses, never shown anger, never let them see how much it bothered him. He was professional. He was polite. He was Keanu. But it was wearing on him in ways he hadn't fully admitted to himself. There was a knock on the door, and a young guy in headphones poked his head in. "We're ready for you," he said cheerfully. Keanu stood up and followed him down a narrow hallway. The closer they got to the studio, the louder the background music became. He could hear the audience out there, talking and laughing, excited for the show to start. These were just regular people who wanted to be entertained. They didn't know anything about what was about to happen. They probably just thought they were going to see Keanu Reeves talk about his movies. He walked through the heavy curtain and onto the bright stage. The audience applauded. The lights were intense, warming his face. He waved and smiled at the crowd, then walked over to shake hands with the host, a man named Richard. Richard had been hosting this show for about 15 years. He had a big smile and an easy way about him that made people feel comfortable. He was good at his job, which somehow made what came next even worse. Keanu sat down in the comfortable chair across from Richard. A production assistant adjusted the microphone on his lapel. Someone called out 30 seconds, and the audience quieted down. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed and friendly. "So, Keanu," Richard began, "before we talk about the new film, I have to ask, how are you doing?" "Really doing?" It was a simple question, the kind people asked all the time. But there was something in the way Richard asked it that made Keanu's instincts kick in. The way he leaned forward just slightly. The way his eyes seemed to be studying Keanu's face, looking for a reaction. "I'm doing well," Keanu said carefully. "Good to be here." "That's great. You know, a lot of people have been wondering about you lately. You're pretty private, which we respect, but sometimes people want to know more about the man behind the movies," Richard said. He smiled that polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can you tell our audience a bit about what your life is really like when the cameras aren't rolling?" This was where it started. Keanu could feel it. This was the moment where the interview was going to veer off the prepared path. He'd been in enough conversations to recognize the subtle shift in tone. Richard was setting up for something. His voice had taken on a different quality, more intimate, more probing, like he was about to ask something that had nothing to do with Keanu's professional life. The audience sat quietly, leaning in. They sensed something was about to happen too. Keanu took a breath. He thought about just getting up and walking off right there. He'd built a career on being able to walk away from things that didn't feel right. But he also knew that if he did that, it would create a bigger scene. People would talk about it. The internet would explode with theories about why Keanu Reeves had walked off a live talk show. That would become the story, not whatever Richard was about to ask him. So he stayed in his seat. He smiled that polite smile he'd perfected over the decades. And he waited to see what was coming next. "I try to keep a pretty balanced life," Keanu answered, keeping his voice steady. "Work, spending time with friends, riding motorcycles. The usual stuff." Richard nodded, but Keanu could see him making a note on the cards in his hand. This was just the warm-up. The real questions were coming, and something told Keanu that his polite, safe answers weren't going to satisfy Richard or the producers who'd scripted this interview. He sat there under the bright lights, feeling very much alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. The warmth from the studio lights suddenly felt suffocating. And somewhere deep inside him, something that had been patient for a very long time began to get tired of being patient. Richard shifted in his chair and leaned forward, his expression changing subtly. The questions that followed weren't about movies or acting techniques. They were carefully crafted to draw out personal information. He asked about Keanu's childhood, his upbringing, his relationship with his father. These weren't hostile questions on the surface, but there was an underlying agenda in how he asked them. Richard was probing, testing to see where Keanu's boundaries were. Then Richard asked something that caught everyone off guard. "You've experienced a lot of loss in your life, Keanu. More than most people. How do you cope with that kind of pain?" He said it softly, like he was being sympathetic, but there was a camera trained on Keanu's face, waiting to capture his emotional reaction. Keanu felt something shift inside him. This was the moment. This was what they were setting him up for. They wanted tears. They wanted pain. They wanted him to break down on camera so they could get the viral moment they'd been planning for. He could see it now, the way Victoria had avoided his eyes in the green room. The way Richard had changed his tone. This was all calculated. He took a breath and gave a measured response about finding strength through reflection and his work. But Richard wasn't satisfied. He kept pushing, kept asking follow-up questions about Keanu's losses. He brought up specific people, specific events, as if he was reading from a dossier he'd prepared. And with each question, Keanu felt something inside him coiling tighter and tighter. The audience had gone very quiet. They could sense that something was happening beneath the surface of this conversation, something real and uncomfortable. This wasn't the usual talk show banter. This was someone being backed into a corner on live television. Richard then did something that crossed the line completely. He brought up Keanu's sister by name, her struggle with leukemia, and asked Keanu to describe what that had been like for him emotionally. He framed it as though he was giving Keanu an opportunity to honor her memory, but the intention was clear. He wanted a moment. He wanted Keanu to cry on camera about the most painful thing he'd ever experienced. Something inside Keanu snapped. Not in the way people might expect. He didn't yell. He didn't stand up aggressively. Instead, he slowly set down the coffee cup that had been in his hand. He took a deep breath. And then, with perfect clarity and absolute stillness, he looked directly at Richard. "I need to stop this right here," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was a firmness to it that made the entire studio feel the shift. The audience tensed. Richard's face went pale. "What do you mean?" Richard asked, confusion flickering across his face. Keanu didn't respond to him directly at first. Instead, he turned slightly to look at the audience. When he spoke to them, not to Richard. "I came here today thinking this was going to be a conversation about my work. About the film I'm proud of. About something I created. But what this really is, what you've all set up here, is an ambush. And I need to talk about that, because I think a lot of people deal with this and don't have the platform to speak about it." Richard tried to interrupt, but Keanu held up his hand. "Let me finish. Please." His tone wasn't aggressive. It was just done. Done with the performance. Done with the game. For 30 years, I've been in this industry. And for most of those 30 years, I've been respectful. I've been polite. I've answered questions about my personal life, my losses, my pain, because I believed that was part of the job. That was the deal I made when I decided to be a public figure. He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about conversation. It stopped being about genuine curiosity. It became about extraction. It became about taking pieces of people's real pain and turning it into entertainment. The studio was completely silent now. Not even the rustle of movement. My sister fought leukemia. She won some days and lost others. She was one of the strongest people I've ever known. But her struggle, her death, that's not a topic for daytime television ratings. His voice wavered slightly, but he continued. When I come here and talk about that, when I let producers ask me to relive that in front of millions of people, I'm not honoring her. I'm participating in the same system that commodifies human pain. That turns grief into content. Richard had shrunk back in his chair. He looked smaller somehow, like he was realizing what he'd done. "You asked me earlier how I cope with loss," Keanu said, turning back to Richard. "I cope by protecting the sacred things in my life. The people I love. The memories I hold close. And I'm done letting that be stripped away for entertainment. I'm done with interviews where the goal is to manipulate me into being emotional for the camera. I'm done with being treated like a character in someone else's story rather than an actual human being with real boundaries." He stood up slowly. The audience watched him, and Keanu could feel the energy in the room shifting. This wasn't going the way anyone had planned. "To everyone watching right now," he said, making direct eye contact with the camera, "if you're in a situation where someone is trying to extract your pain, trying to turn your worst moments into their content, you don't have to play along. You don't have to be gracious about it. You don't have to protect other people's comfort at the expense of your own dignity. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to walk away." He looked back at Richard one more time. "I'm sure you're a good person in your regular life. I'm sure you didn't wake up thinking about how you were going to ambush someone. But this system, this machine that we've all built, it encourages this. It rewards this. And someone has to stop participating in it." Then, with absolute composure, Keanu unbuttoned his microphone and set it on the chair. He smoothed down his jacket, took a breath, and walked off the stage. He didn't storm off. He didn't make a dramatic exit. He simply walked away with the kind of quiet dignity that somehow felt more powerful than any explosion could have been. The audience erupted. But it wasn't the kind of applause they'd been coached to give for entertainment. It was something different. It was recognition. It was respect. Some people were standing, clapping slowly and deliberately. Others had their hands over their mouths, shocked. And a few were openly crying. Richard sat alone in his chair, frozen, not knowing what to do or say. The production team was in chaos offstage, realizing that their carefully planned moment had completely backfired. They'd expected drama. They'd expected tears. What they got was something far more powerful. They got truth. And truth, once spoken on live television, can't be edited out or controlled. Keanu walked backstage and directly toward the exit. Production assistants tried to stop him, asking if he was okay, if he wanted to continue, if they could reschedule. He thanked them politely but firmly declined. He didn't need to continue. He'd said what needed to be said. As he reached the back exit of the studio, the noise from the audience was still audible. They were still talking about what had just happened, still processing it. Keanu pushed open the door and stepped out into the afternoon air. The Los Angeles sun felt warm on his face. He took a deep breath and realized that for the first time in a very long time, he felt like himself again. Not the version he showed the world. Not the carefully constructed public persona. Just himself. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how the media would spin this, or what his team would say, or how it would affect his career. But in that moment, standing in the parking lot with the sun on his face, he knew something important had shifted. He'd drawn a line. He'd taken back control of his own story. And somehow, that made everything else feel manageable. The video went live within minutes. By the time Keanu reached his car, his phone was already buzzing with notifications. He'd learned long ago not to check social media immediately after something controversial happened, but he could feel the weight of it anyway. The world was watching. The world was talking. He drove through Los Angeles in silence, not putting on any music, just sitting with his thoughts. He knew that what he'd done was going to have consequences. The network would probably issue a statement. There would be think pieces and hot takes. Some people would criticize him for being rude or ungrateful. Others would defend him. That's how these things always went. What he didn't expect was the speed and the overwhelmingly positive response. By evening, the clip had been viewed millions of times. But the comments weren't what you'd normally see on viral videos. People weren't mocking him or tearing him down. Instead, they were sharing their own stories. Parents who'd lost children talked about how seeing Keanu protect the memory of his sister made them feel less alone. People who worked in high-pressure environments shared that watching him set a boundary gave them courage to do the same in their own lives. Therapists and mental health professionals were posting about how his moment on television was a masterclass in healthy boundary setting. The narrative was completely different from what the network had anticipated. Instead of creating a scandal, instead of generating the kind of drama that feeds tabloids and entertainment gossip, Keanu had created something that genuinely resonated with millions of people. His phone rang. It was his longtime manager, David. Keanu had worked with David for over 20 years. David knew him better than almost anyone in the industry. "I've already gotten 40 calls," David said, not bothering with pleasantries. "From journalists, from other networks, from producers. Everyone wants a statement. Everyone wants an interview with you." "I'm not doing any interviews," Keanu said calmly. "I know. That's what I told them. But Keanu, do you realize what's happened here? This is huge. And it's good. People are responding incredibly well to what you said." Keanu could hear the surprise in David's voice. He'd expected fallout. He'd expected damage control to be necessary. Instead, the public was largely on Keanu's side. The host, Richard, was facing serious backlash from industry colleagues and the general public. The network was issuing apologies and promising to review their interview practices. "I just needed to say it," Keanu told David. "I'm not going to capitalize on it or turn it into some statement about the industry. I said what I needed to say." But what was interesting was that Keanu couldn't ignore it even if he wanted to. The moment had become something bigger than himself. Over the next few days, he started receiving letters. Actual handwritten letters, sent to his office. People poured their hearts out in these letters. One came from a man named Robert who'd lost his son 5 years ago. Robert wrote about how every interview he'd seen, every celebrity who'd talked about their loss, felt performative to him. He felt like the world wanted to watch grief like it was entertainment. But watching Keanu refuse to do that, watching him protect his sister's memory, made Robert feel seen. It made him feel like his own instinct to keep his son's memory sacred was valid. Another letter came from a young woman who worked in an office where her boss constantly asked her invasive personal questions. The woman had always felt like she had to answer, like it was part of being professional and friendly. But watching Keanu simply say no, watching him walk away without being rude about it, gave her permission to do the same thing. She'd set boundaries with her boss the very next day. Then there was a letter from a therapist who ran support groups for people dealing with grief and loss. The therapist said that in her next session, she was going to show the clip to her group and use it as a teaching moment about boundaries and self-protection. She thanked Keanu for giving her group something real to work with. Keanu sat in his apartment reading these letters, and he felt something he hadn't expected. He'd thought walking off that stage was going to be a moment of closure for him. But it had turned into something else. It had turned into the beginning of a conversation that extended far beyond him personally. His friend Tom called one evening. Tom had known Keanu since before he was famous, back when they were just two guys trying to make it in the industry. "I watched it like 5 times, Tom said. "Do you know what struck me the most? It wasn't what you said. It was how you said it. You weren't angry. You were just done. There's something about that kind of calm refusal that's more powerful than yelling ever could be." "I wasn't trying to make it powerful," Keanu said. "I was just being honest." "I know. That's the thing. That's what made it work. If you'd gone out there and made a big dramatic scene, people would have dismissed you. They would have said you were being difficult or ungrateful. But you walked out of there with more dignity than most people could muster. You made it impossible for them to spin the narrative against you." After he hung up, Keanu thought about what Tom had said. He hadn't done this for impact. He hadn't planned the way he'd handled it to be strategic or calculated. He'd simply reached a point where he couldn't do it anymore, and the way he'd expressed that had come from someplace authentic. That authenticity was what had resonated. The network issued an official apology within a week. They announced that they were going to implement new guidelines for interviews, requiring that guests be informed of all major topics in advance, and giving them the right to decline certain lines of questioning. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was something. And it had happened specifically because of what Keanu had done on that stage. More importantly, other networks started paying attention. Word got around the industry that if you tried to blindside Keanu Reeves, or likely anyone else with a similar level of self-respect, you would face serious consequences. The incident became a quiet reminder to producers and hosts that their guests weren't just content to be manipulated. They were human beings with legitimate boundaries. Keanu found himself thinking back to that moment when he decided to stay seated instead of walking away in the green room. He was glad he'd stayed. Not because of the impact, but because it had forced him to finally confront something he'd been ignoring for years. He'd let the industry take pieces of him. He'd told himself it was part of the job, that this was the price of being public. But watching the response to him refusing to do that anymore, he realized how many other people felt the same way. His phone buzzed with another message from David. Apparently, several major studios wanted to talk to Keanu about his next project. Some of them specifically mentioned that they appreciated his integrity and wanted to work with someone of that caliber. The incident that was supposed to derail his career had somehow made him more valuable. People respected him more. Industry professionals respected him more. But Keanu knew that wasn't really the point. The point wasn't that walking away had made him more bankable or more respected in Hollywood. The point was that he'd finally given himself permission to be whole. To protect his inner life. To stop performing pain for strangers. That evening, he sat on his couch with a cup of tea and pulled up the comments on the video one more time. Thousands and thousands of people sharing their own experiences of having their boundaries violated, of being asked to perform their pain, of finally feeling validated in wanting to protect the sacred parts of their lives. And Keanu realized that what he'd done wasn't just for himself anymore. It had become something that mattered to a lot of people. It had opened a door that many people needed to walk through. It had given permission to millions of people to value their own dignity. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. 3 months after walking off that stage, Keanu stood in a small independent film production office. The studio was nothing like the big Hollywood lots he was used to. It was filled with natural light, worn furniture, and people who were genuinely passionate about telling stories that mattered to them. The director, a woman named Catherine, was talking about a project that had been sitting in development for years. It was a story about grief and healing, about loss and how people move forward. It wasn't a blockbuster. It wouldn't make hundreds of millions at the box office. But it was real and it was necessary. This was how Keanu had started choosing his projects now. Not based on commercial potential or franchise appeal, but based on whether the story meant something to him. Whether it would allow him to create something authentic rather than just add another number to a studio's profit sheet. "Why do you want to do this?" Catherine asked him, setting down her coffee. "It's not exactly a glamorous project. The budget is small. The marketing will be limited." Keanu thought about how to answer her honestly. "Because I'm tired of pretending," he said simply. "I spent most of my career doing what I thought I was supposed to do. What audiences expected. What studios wanted. And I realized that most of those projects don't mean anything to me now when I look back on them. But the ones where I got to be genuine, where I didn't have to perform, those are the ones that stay with me." Catherine nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. The other thing that had changed for Keanu was how he approached interviews and public appearances. He was more selective. He only worked with journalists and outlets that he trusted. He did fewer interviews overall, but the ones he did do were deeper, more thoughtful conversations rather than quick promotional hits. He'd started turning down invitations to big talk shows entirely. His management team was nervous about it at first, but they'd quickly realized that this approach was actually working. Keanu's stock hadn't gone down. If anything, his brand had become stronger because it was now associated with integrity. One afternoon, David called him with an interesting offer. A major magazine wanted to do a long-form interview with him. Not about his movies or his career, but about his philosophy on life, his approach to boundaries, and what had changed for him since the incident. "Do you want to do it?" David asked. Keanu considered it. Part of him wanted to just keep his head down and not talk about any of it. But another part of him knew that maybe he had something useful to say. Maybe there were people listening who needed to hear that it was okay to protect themselves, that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, that you could say no to people and situations that violated your dignity. "Yeah," he told David. "I'll do it. But I want approval over the final piece. And I want them to know that I'm not going to be talking about my personal losses in detail. I'll talk about the principle but not the specifics." The interview took place over 3 sessions in Keanu's home. The journalist was thoughtful and respectful, asking real questions and actually listening to the answers. When the piece came out, it was powerful. Keanu talked about how celebrities are often treated as property rather than people. He talked about the responsibility that comes with having a platform. He discussed how the media landscape had changed and why that made it more important than ever for people to protect their boundaries. The article went viral in a different way than the talk show incident had. This wasn't a shocking moment. This was thoughtful analysis from someone who'd actually experienced the system from the inside. Other actors started reaching out to Keanu privately, thanking him for speaking up. Some of them started setting similar boundaries in their own careers. Then something unexpected happened. A nonprofit organization that worked on media ethics and press freedom reached out to Keanu. They wanted him to be part of a panel discussion about the intersection of celebrity, privacy, and journalistic responsibility. They wanted to use his experience as a case study for how things could change. Keanu was hesitant at first. He didn't want to position himself as an activist or a spokesperson. But after talking to David and thinking about it, he realized this was different from self-promotion. This was actually trying to create systemic change. The panel took place at a major media conference. Keanu sat alongside journalists, producers, and other industry professionals. When he spoke about his experience not as a victim, but as a human being who'd simply decided he wasn't going to participate in a system that didn't feel right to him. "The thing is," he said during the discussion, "I'm not special. I had the platform and the financial security to walk away. Most people don't have that luxury. Most people need their job, and they can't afford to stand up to invasive or unethical practices. So the change has to come from those of us who do have some level of security. We have to demand better. The conversation that followed was intense and genuine. Some journalists got defensive, talking about the importance of access and asking difficult questions. But Keanu didn't attack them. He just kept coming back to the same point. There's a difference between good journalism and exploitation. There's a way to ask hard questions without stripping away someone's humanity in the process. After the panel, several younger journalists approached him. They talked about how they'd felt pressured by their editors to ask invasive questions, to cross lines they didn't feel comfortable crossing. Keanu's willingness to name what was happening had given them permission to push back against those pressures in their own work. A few weeks later, David sent Keanu an article from a major journalism publication. It was about ethical interviewing practices. The author specifically cited Keanu's incident as a turning point moment that had sparked a broader conversation in the industry about accountability and respect. Apparently, several networks had started implementing the kinds of guidelines that had come out after Keanu's walk-off, and now other media organizations were following suit. It wasn't a massive revolution. The industry was still fundamentally built on the same structures. But there was a shift happening. A small shift, maybe, but a real one. Keanu also started working more directly with causes he cared about. He established a foundation in honor of those he'd lost, but he set it up in a way that felt authentic to him. He didn't go on talk shows to promote it. He didn't use it as a way to generate publicity. Instead, the foundation did quiet work, funding research and support services for people dealing with similar losses. One day, he received a letter from a young man who'd been helped by the foundation. The man had lost his brother and had been struggling for years with grief and isolation. The foundation's support services had connected him with a grief counselor and a support group. The man wrote that for the first time since his brother's death, he felt like he wasn't alone. Reading that letter, Keanu understood something important. The explosion on live television, the walk-off, the viral moment, all of that had been necessary. But it wasn't the most important thing that had come from that moment. The most important thing was that it had freed him up to channel his energy into work that actually mattered. Work that created real change in real people's lives. He was also noticing changes in himself. He was sleeping better. He felt less of the constant tension that had come from pretending to be okay with boundary violations. His relationships with his friends felt deeper because he wasn't exhausted all the time from performing. He had more energy for his work, and his work had become more meaningful. Catherine called him one evening about the film they'd been developing together. "The script is almost done," she said excitedly. "And I've been thinking about it, and this character, he's becoming less like what you usually play and more like, well, more like you. Is that okay?" "That's more than okay," Keanu said. "That's exactly what I want now. I want to play characters that feel like extensions of who I actually am, not these constructed versions of myself." That was the real reckoning that had happened. It wasn't just about standing up to a talk show host or challenging the industry's exploitative practices. It was about Keanu finally giving himself permission to be himself in every part of his life, including his professional work. The system was still there. The pressure to perform, to give away pieces of yourself, to commodify your pain, it hadn't disappeared. But Keanu had found a way to navigate it without surrendering his integrity. And in doing that, he'd become something he'd never quite been before, completely whole. A year had passed since that moment on live television. Keanu sat in a small cafe in Los Angeles, one that he'd been visiting for years but that most people didn't know about. It wasn't fancy or trendy. It just made good coffee and had a quiet corner where he could think. He was reading a book, actually reading something for pleasure, which was something he rarely made time for these days. The cafe was mostly empty on this Tuesday afternoon. There were a few regulars scattered around, people who were lost in their own worlds, their own thoughts. None of them paid attention to him. That was one of the things he appreciated about this place. People respected privacy here. They understood that sometimes you just wanted to exist without being observed or analyzed. A young man approached his table hesitantly. Keanu recognized the nervous energy immediately. This was someone who recognized him, someone who was working up the courage to say something. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young man said, his voice uncertain. I wanted to say something." Keanu set down his book and smiled. There was something about this kid's genuine nervousness that made Keanu want to listen. No bother at all. Please, sit down if you want. The young man, who introduced himself as Devin, sat across from Keanu. He looked like he was in his mid-20s, probably a student or someone early in his career. His hands were shaking slightly as he spoke. I saw what you did on that talk show, Devin said. The thing where you walked off. It was about a year ago. Yeah, I remember, Keanu said gently. I was going through something really hard at that time. I was in school, and I had a professor who kept pushing for personal information about my family situation. He wanted me to talk about things in class that were private, and he made it feel like if I didn't share, I wasn't being open-minded or collaborative. I felt pressured, and I didn't know how to say no without seeming rude or difficult. Devin paused, collecting his thoughts. But then I watched that video of you. And I watched how you said no without being mean about it. How you just protected your own boundaries. And I thought, if this guy can do that on live television in front of millions of people, I can do it with my professor. So I did. I told him that some things were personal and that I wasn't going to discuss them in class. And you know what? He actually respected it. He apologized and said he hadn't realized how he was coming across. Keanu felt something warm move through his chest. This was exactly the kind of ripple effect he'd never anticipated when he'd walked off that stage. I'm really glad you did that, Keanu said. I'm glad it worked out for you. Yeah, but that's not even the main thing I wanted to tell you, Devin continued. The main thing is that you gave me permission to value my own boundaries. And that's changed everything for me. My relationships are better now because I'm not constantly giving away pieces of myself. I'm actually doing better in school because I'm not spending all my energy trying to manage other people's feelings about my boundaries. I just wanted to thank you for that. After Devin left, Keanu sat with his coffee for a long time. He thought about how many conversations like this he'd had over the past year. Not all of them in person, but through letters, emails, messages from people who'd been affected by what he'd done. Some were small moments, like Devin's story. Others were bigger, more significant changes in people's lives. The thing that struck him most was that none of these people were asking him for anything. They weren't asking for advice or trying to turn the moment into something more than what it was. They were just saying thank you. They were saying that what he'd done had mattered to them. That evening, Keanu met with Catherine to see the rough cut of the film they'd been working on. Sitting in the screening room, watching his character move across the screen, Keanu barely recognized himself. Not in a bad way. It was just that he was so present in this work, so authentically himself, that it felt different from anything he'd done before. The character was a man processing grief and loss, but in a realistic way. Not the Hollywood version where people break down dramatically and then recover by the end of the second act. But the real version, where grief is something you learn to carry, where healing is messy and nonlinear, where you never really get over it, so much as you learn how to live with it. Catherine watched his face as he watched the film. When it ended, she didn't ask him what he thought right away. She just sat with him. This is the best work I've ever done, Keanu said finally. And I mean that in the most genuine way possible. I know, Catherine said. That's why I wanted to make this film with you. Because you finally gave yourself permission to be real. Over the next few months, the film made its way through the festival circuit. It didn't win any major awards, but critics responded to it with genuine respect. More importantly, it found an audience with people who understood what it was trying to do. People who'd experienced loss came to screenings and said that finally, they were seeing something that felt true to their experience. Keanu also started giving occasional talks at universities about media ethics, about boundaries, about the importance of protecting your inner life. These weren't big, flashy events. They were small conversations in auditoriums with students who were trying to figure out how to navigate a world that constantly wanted things from them. One evening, after a talk at a university in Northern California, a group of students gathered around to ask questions. One of them, a young woman studying journalism, asked him something that caught him off guard. Do you regret doing what you did on that talk show? Like, even though it turned out well, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you just answered the questions and been polite about it? Keanu thought about it honestly. No, he said. I don't regret it. But I also want to be clear that I'm not proud of the fact that it went viral or that it created all this impact. What I'm proud of is that I was honest. That I protected something that mattered to me. The rest of it is just what happened after that. And yeah, I'm grateful for it. But I didn't do it for that reason. By the time the year anniversary of the talk show incident came around, Keanu had mostly stopped thinking about it as the defining moment of his life. It had been important, yes. It had changed things, both for himself and apparently for a lot of other people. But it wasn't his whole story. It was just one moment where he'd finally decided to be himself, and the consequences of that decision had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have predicted. He received calls from various networks asking if he wanted to do an anniversary interview, to reflect on what had happened and how much things had changed. He turned them all down. He didn't need to revisit it. He was busy living his life now in a way that felt authentic. Instead, what Keanu did on the anniversary was something quiet. He went to a bookstore and spent the afternoon reading. He had dinner with Tom, his old friend from the beginning of his career. They talked about life and work and what it meant to get older and still be learning about yourself. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Keanu pulled up the video one more time. He watched himself sitting in that chair, watched the moment of clarity and decision wash over him, watched himself walk away. It felt like watching a different person, even though it was clearly him. Maybe that was the point. The person he'd been before that moment and the person he'd become after were fundamentally different. He thought about the trembling in his hands that he'd felt in the green room, the anxiety about what was coming. That anxiety had been valid. Something bad had been about to happen. But instead of enduring it politely, he'd stopped it. He'd said no. And that no had been the beginning of everything changing. The next morning, Keanu woke up without the weight he used to carry. That weight that came from constantly performing, from protecting other people's comfort at the expense of his own well-being. It was gone. Or maybe it had never really been gone, but he'd learned how to set it down instead of carrying it everywhere. He went for a long drive up the coast, windows down, not thinking about anything in particular. Just being present in the moment, in the feeling of the sun and the wind and the road moving beneath him. This was what he'd gained from that explosion on live television. Not fame or vindication or industry respect, though those things had come. What he'd really gained was the ability to just be himself without apologizing for it. And in that freedom, he'd found something that no amount of success or recognition could have given him: peace. Real, genuine, earned peace that came from knowing you'd done the hard thing, the right thing, the honest thing. And that everything that followed, whether it was good or bad, was authentic. He didn't know what came next in his career or his life. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't anxious about the future. He was just living it, moment by moment, with presence and intention and the deep satisfaction of knowing that he'd finally chosen himself.